If I told you just 2 years ago that America's closest allies would be lining up at Beijing's doorstep, practically begging to do business with China, you would have called me crazy. But here we are in 2026, and that is exactly what is happening. And honestly, the speed at which this is unfolding is unlike anything we have seen in modern geopolitics. If you are new here, welcome to the channel. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe because we are breaking down some of the biggest shifts in global power dynamics, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. So let's get straight into it. Since the start of this year, foreign leaders from across Asia, the Americas, and Europe have been visiting China in quick succession. We are talking about the Prime Ministers of Canada, Finland, Ireland, the United Kingdom, the President of South Korea, the President of Uruguay, and even French President Emmanuel Macron. All of them, one after another, flying to Beijing, shaking hands with President Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People, touring the Forbidden City, and signing deals. Forbes magazine actually noted that Beijing was rolling out the red carpet almost daily for foreign dignitaries seeking, and I quote, a less chaotic economic environment. Let that sink in for a moment. The world is literally looking at China and saying, you know what, at least they are predictable. Now, why is this happening? Well, you cannot understand this diplomatic surge without understanding what is going on across the Pacific. President Donald Trump's tariff wars have fundamentally shaken the global trade order. Since February of 2025, when Trump invoked emergency powers to slap tariffs on practically every major trading partner, the world has been scrambling. The overall average effective tariff rate in the United States skyrocketed from about 2.5% to an estimated 27%, the highest level in over a century. And this was not just aimed at China. These tariffs hit allies and adversaries alike. Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, all of them got caught in the crossfire. And the thing is, after a year of flattering Trump, trying to negotiate, making pilgrimages to the White House, many of these leaders have realized something uncomfortable. The United States, under this administration, is simply not a reliable partner anymore. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said out loud, he literally called the United States no longer a reliable partner. And then he did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. He flew to Beijing. In early January of 2026, Carney visited China for the first time in nearly a decade of frozen relations between Ottawa and Beijing. And he did not just go for a photo opportunity. He signed multiple cooperation agreements. Canada agreed to cut tariffs on a limited number of Chinese-made electric vehicles down to 6.1% from a staggering 100%. In exchange, China lowered its import duties on Canadian canola seeds and other agricultural products. After the trip, Carney stood in Quebec City and said something remarkable. He said, in a time of rising walls and thickening borders, we demonstrate how a country can be both open and secure, welcoming and strong, principled and powerful. He described Canada's relationship with China as, get this, more predictable than its current ties with the United States. That is a sitting Canadian Prime Minister saying that dealing with Beijing is more stable than dealing with Washington. Think about that for a second. Now, Trump did not take kindly to this. He threatened to slap an additional 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Carney went ahead with his China deal. He even warned that China would eat Canada alive and devour it. But Carney, a former Goldman Sachs executive and former head of the central banks in both Canada and the United Kingdom, clearly was not intimidated. He pushed forward anyway, framing the visit as part of a broader strategy to ensure Canada thrives by building independent, mutually beneficial partnerships rather than relying on what he called unstable powers. And that is the key word right there, unstable. When your closest ally starts using the word unstable to describe you, something has gone terribly wrong. But Canada was just the beginning. Let us talk about the United Kingdom. On January 29th, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer landed in Beijing for the first visit by a UK leader in 8 years. 8 years. The last time a British Prime Minister was in China was back in 2018, when Theresa May made the trip. Since then, relations had been absolutely frozen. The crackdown on Hong Kong's democracy movement in 2019 and 2020, the sweeping national security legislation, the imprisonment of British citizen and media tycoon Jimmy Lai, the accusations of Chinese espionage on British soil, all of these had pushed London and Beijing further and further apart. Previous prime ministers would not even consider the trip. But Starmer, he saw the writing on the wall. And what was written on that wall was a very clear message. Trump's tariffs are coming for everyone, and the UK needs alternatives. A source close to Starmer reportedly told the Observer newspaper that Starmer believed it was, and I quote, a dereliction of duty by previous prime ministers not to go to China. That is a pretty strong statement. And he did not go alone. Nearly 60 British businesses and cultural organizations sent representatives along for the ride. We're talking about the chairman of HSBC, the CEO of AstraZeneca, executives from Airbus, British Airways, GSK, and dozens more. This was not a courtesy call. This was a full-scale economic offensive. And the results were significant. Starmer's meeting with Xi Jinping was originally scheduled for 40 minutes. It ran to 80 minutes. During the visit, the two leaders agreed to develop what they called a long-term and consistent comprehensive strategic partnership. The UK secured £2.2 billion in export deals and approximately £2.3 billion in expanded market access over 5 years. China agreed to cut tariffs on British whiskey exports from 10% down to 5%, a change estimated to add about £250 million to the UK economy. Chinese energy storage manufacturer HiTHIUM pledged to invest £200 million in Britain and create around 300 jobs. Pop Mart, the company behind the viral Labubu toy, announced it would set up London as a regional headquarters. Chery Commercial Vehicles said it would establish a European headquarters in Liverpool. AstraZeneca announced plans to invest $15 billion in China through 2030. And perhaps most symbolically, China agreed to allow British citizens visa-free entry for stays of up to 30 days for tourism and business. Now here is the really interesting part. Both Starmer and Carney made a point of visiting the Forbidden City during their trips. Xi Jinping personally arranged these visits, almost like a diplomatic ritual. Starmer, walking through the ancient palace complex, told reporters that strengthening ties with China is in the national interest because of the huge opportunities provided by the world's second-largest economy. That is why we have got such a big business delegation, he said. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo, who also visited China in late January with a delegation of top business executives, was equally impressed. He called the Forbidden City stunning and said you do not understand China unless you go to China. These are not pro-China ideologues speaking. These are pragmatic Western leaders who have looked at the current global landscape and made a calculated decision that engagement with Beijing is better than isolation, and is not just about individual countries making deals with China. The entire global trade architecture is shifting. The European Union, feeling the pressure of Trump's tariffs and his unpredictable demands, went on what can only be described as a deal-making spree. In January of 2026 alone, the EU signed a landmark trade agreement with the Mercosur bloc of South American nations, creating one of the world's largest free trade areas, covering approximately 700 million consumers across 31 countries. That deal could save EU firms over €4 billion per year in customs duties. And then, just 10 days later, the EU and India concluded negotiations on what European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the mother of all deals, creating a free trade zone of 2 billion people representing about 25% of global GDP. Under that agreement, India will eliminate or reduce tariffs on 96.6% of EU exports. Car tariffs, which were previously as high as 110%, will gradually drop to 10%. The EU, in exchange, will reduce tariffs on 99.5% of Indian imports. These deals have been in various stages of negotiation for years, some for decades. The EU-India talks had been going on and off for nearly 20 years. But what finally pushed them over the finish line? Trump's tariffs. The immediate impetus to get it done now, as one analyst from the Atlantic Council put it, was the need for both sides to diversify their trade relationships in response to uncertainty, if not outright antagonism, from the United States. Now, let us look at this from Beijing's perspective, because this is where it gets really fascinating. You would think China would be celebrating this diplomatic windfall, right? And to some extent, they are. Xi Jinping has been using these visits to brief world leaders on China's 15th five-year plan for 2026 through 2030, pitching China's future development as a source of new opportunities for the world. He has been talking about high-quality development and high-level opening up. He has been quoting classical Chinese proverbs to visiting leaders. When he met the South Korean president, he talked about neighbors helping each other. When he met the Irish Prime Minister, the first Irish leader to visit in 14 years, he emphasized mutual trust. When he spoke with Trump on the phone, he quoted an ancient saying about how it is always right to do a good thing, however small, and always wrong to do a bad thing, however small. But behind the diplomatic pleasantries, Chinese strategic thinkers are actually quite skeptical about this sudden Western warm-up. And this is a perspective that does not get enough coverage in Western media. A leading Chinese scholar on American politics compared the U.S.-Europe relationship to a marriage, using a Chinese idiom that translates roughly as they may quarrel at the headboard, but they reconcile at the foot of the bed. In other words, Chinese analysts believe that no matter how much Western nations flirt with Beijing, their fundamental allegiance remains with the United States-led order. The West, in their view, remains an exclusive club, temporarily dysfunctional perhaps, but still a club. Britain's overtures, from Beijing's standpoint, look like the latest policy oscillation driven by the fickle whims of Washington. Today they are knocking on China's door because Trump is being unpredictable. Tomorrow, when a new administration takes over or when Trump changes his mind, they will pivot right back. And you know what? There is some historical basis for that skepticism. Remember, Trump himself had two glitzy summits with Xi back in 2017. One at Mar-a-Lago, one in Beijing's Forbidden City. Both were hailed as breakthroughs. And what followed? The onset of tariffs and the first wave of the U.S.-China trade war in 2018 and 2019. So the Chinese have learned to be cautious about Western diplomatic love-bombing. But here is what is different this time, and this is the crucial point. The structural conditions have changed. Trump's tariff regime is not a temporary blip. The average tax increase per U.S. household from these tariffs is estimated at about $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. Corporate bankruptcies in the United States have hit the highest level since 2010. Jobs growth has slowed significantly. The promised manufacturing boom has not materialized. And perhaps most importantly, 55% of tariff costs are now being passed on to consumers. Americans are anxious about the economy. They are anxious about losing their jobs. And America's allies are anxious about whether they can count on the U.S. at all. Meanwhile, major European banks like Standard Chartered, Société Générale, and the Netherlands ING have published research reports saying that China is on course to maintain steady economic growth this year, showing great resilience among major economies. 2026 marks the beginning of China's 15th five-year plan, and Beijing is positioning itself as the responsible, predictable alternative to Washington's chaos. It is a remarkable reversal of the narrative that has dominated Western media for years, the idea that China is the unpredictable authoritarian threat, and the U.S. is the stable democratic anchor. Right now, from the perspective of many world leaders, it is exactly the opposite. There is also a broader geopolitical dimension here that we need to talk about. While Western politicians like Carney fret over a rupture in the post-Cold War order for much of the global South, there is no rupture at all. There is just the continuation of U.S.-led hegemony under a different, more aggressive guise. For countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, the choice is not between the U.S. and China. It is about extracting concessions from both superpowers while avoiding the wrath of either. This is the new game of global politics, and China is playing it masterfully. Xi Jinping kicked off 2026 with what the South China Morning Post called an extraordinary example of China's diplomacy. On the Chinese calendar's first day of spring, called Lichuan, she held a video meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and then spoke by phone with Trump. Back-to-back conversations with the leaders of the world's two other great powers, sending a clear signal that China sits at the center of global affairs. He also designated 2026 through 2027 as the China-Russia years of education. He continued the 36-year tradition of Chinese foreign ministers beginning each year with a trip to Africa. And he designated 2026 as the China-Africa year of people-to-people exchanges. Every move calculated, every message deliberate. Now, I want to be clear about something. This does not mean that China's economy is without problems. Far from it. The property sector is still struggling. Consumer confidence remains fragile. Youth unemployment is a concern. Deflationary pressures have dampened demand for premium goods. But on the diplomatic front, Xi Jinping is executing a masterclass in leveraging external chaos to enhance China's global position. While America is busy threatening its own allies with tariffs and demanding ownership of Greenland, and making derisive comments about countries that fought alongside it in Afghanistan and Iraq, China is rolling out the red carpet and signing deals. As Yale professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld wrote, Trump has started a trade war that the U.S. cannot win alone. Tackling China's market manipulations, the subsidies, the intellectual property concerns, the forced technology transfers, all of those legitimate grievances would require collective action from a united front of democratic allies. But Trump has systematically undermined that collective action through his indiscriminate use of tariffs against those very allies. Without carrots to complement the stick, the U.S. risks becoming isolated as its leverage diminishes. Or, as Sonnenfeld put more colorfully, when you overuse a stick, it tends to break, even if it is an American stick. And this is really the core of the story. Xi Jinping's gain in global leverage is not primarily the result of some brilliant Chinese strategy, although the diplomacy has been skillful. It is primarily the result of American self-sabotage. Every time Trump threatens to impose 100% tariffs on Canada for daring to make a deal with China, he pushes another ally closer to Beijing. Every time he threatens South Korea for not ratifying trade deals fast enough, he validates China's argument that the U.S. is an unreliable partner. Every time the EU signs another megadeal with India or Mercosur or anyone else, it is building a world that is less dependent on American goodwill and more open to Chinese engagement. Jack Perry, chairman of the 48 Group, a British business organization focused on trade with China, summed it up perfectly. He said, "You do not understand China unless you go to China. Go to China, embrace China, and move forward." That sentiment would have been controversial, maybe even career-ending, for a prominent business leader just a few years ago. Today is mainstream. And that tells you everything you need to know about how dramatically the geopolitical landscape has shifted. Looking ahead, Trump and Xi are reportedly planning to meet as many as 4 times this year, with Trump expected to visit China in April. The American Chamber of Commerce in China has urged both leaders to create a vision for greater global stability. But the dynamics have shifted. China is no longer the supplicant in these meetings. When the world's major allies are already at your door, your negotiating position is fundamentally different. Former British Member of Parliament Mark Logan, who has worked in China for many years, made an observation that I think captures this moment perfectly. He said that in Western societies, many of China's positive cultural and social characteristics have yet to be fully recognized. And he is right that the first-hand engagement by leaders like Starmer, Carney, and Orpo is providing a more nuanced picture than the one-dimensional threat narrative that has dominated Western discourse. Whether you agree with these leaders' decisions to engage with Beijing or not, the reality is clear. The world is changing. The old order is cracking. And Xi Jinping is standing right there, ready to fill the gaps. Now, does this mean China has won? No, not by a long shot. The U.S. is still the world's largest economy by far, with a GDP of about $28.75 trillion compared to China's $18.74 trillion. American military supremacy remains unchallenged. And as that Chinese scholar noted, the Western club may be dysfunctional, but it is still a club. Countries that are formally allied with the U.S. or dependent on it for security guarantees, from Japan to Saudi Arabia, have far less room to maneuver than their diplomatic gestures might suggest. Europe is the classic case, reliant on America for security, but increasingly dependent on China for trade and technology. But the trend lines are unmistakable. Every deal signed, every handshake in Beijing, every leader who walks through the Forbidden City chips away a little more at the American-dominated order that has defined global politics since the end of the Cold War. And that is a story that is going to keep unfolding throughout 2026 and beyond. So what do you think? Is this diplomatic surge toward China a temporary reaction to Trump's tariffs, or are we seeing the beginning of a fundamental realignment in global power? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear what you have to say about this, because this is one of those stories that affects all of us, no matter where in the world you are watching from. And hey, if you made it this far, you are clearly someone who cares about understanding what is really going on in the world. So do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. We are going to keep breaking down the biggest geopolitical stories as they unfold, and I promise you, the next few months are going to be absolutely wild. I will see you in the next one. Take care.